For nearly a decade, a strange and mysterious lump near his garden shed had been a quiet puzzle for 75-year-old retired farmer Harold Wilson. When he first moved into his suburban home, it was just a small, barely noticeable mound of earth. But over the years, with a slow, almost imperceptible force, it grew larger, pushing its way up through his manicured lawn. One day, Harold had finally had enough. He grabbed his shovel, determined to solve the bizarre mystery of his growing backyard, completely unaware that he was about to unearth a deadly, forgotten secret from the Second World War. But before we start our story, smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and hit that notifications bell so you won't miss any of our new, incredible stories. To understand the central mystery of our story, the growing lump, we must first explore one of nature's most powerful and patient geological forces, a phenomenon known as frost heaving. In regions with cold winters, the ground is subject to a constant annual cycle of freezing and thawing. When the water present in the soil freezes, it expands with incredible force, by about 9%. This expansion can push soil, pavement, and even building foundations upwards. But the real magic happens when it interacts with a buried object, like a rock or, in our story, a metal box. During a deep freeze, ice crystals begin to form beneath the object. These crystals attract more water from the surrounding unfrozen soil, a process called cryosuction. This causes a larger, concentrated lens of ice to grow directly beneath the object, slowly and powerfully jacking it up, lifting it a few millimeters closer to the surface. Then, when the spring thaw arrives, the ground melts. But the object does not settle back down to its original position. The space beneath it is quickly filled in by smaller pebbles and soil particles that slump into the void. The object is now resting on a new, slightly higher foundation. This cycle repeats, year after year, winter after winter. It is a slow-motion, natural hydraulic lift. Over the course of a decade, this relentless freeze-thaw cycle can push a deeply buried object several feet, causing it to create a mysterious, ever-growing mound on the surface. It was this silent, powerful force of nature that was working year after year in Harold Wilson's backyard, slowly pushing a dangerous secret from the past back into the present day. Our story's protagonist, Harold Wilson, was a man who knew the land. As a retired farmer, he was a patient and observant person, attuned to the slow, subtle rhythms of the natural world. When he and his wife moved into their quiet, suburban home to enjoy their retirement, the small, raised mound of earth next to his garden shed was just a minor curiosity. He initially assumed it was the result of a buried tree stump or some uneven landscaping from the previous owner. But over the years, he noticed it was changing. Every spring, after the last of the snow had melted, the lump seemed to be just a little bit bigger, a little more pronounced. His wife joked that he was growing a pet rock, but Harold, with his farmer's intuition, knew that the earth doesn't just grow on its own. Something was pushing from below. After nearly a decade of watching and wondering, he decided it was time to solve the puzzle. He armed himself with a sturdy shovel and began to dig into the mysterious mound. The first few feet were just topsoil and clay, the same as the rest of his garden. He began to think that maybe it was just a strange geological feature after all. Then his shovel struck something hard with a loud, metallic clang that vibrated up the wooden handle and into his arms. It was not the dull thud of a rock. It was the unmistakable sound of steel hitting steel. Excited now, he began to dig with a renewed sense of purpose. He cleared away more dirt, and the outline of a dark, rectangular object began to emerge. It was some kind of metal box, rusted and heavy. It looked like a military-style ammunition box from a bygone era. He managed to dig all the way around it and, with a great deal of effort, heave the heavy container out of the hole. He stood back, catching his breath, and looked at his discovery. It was an old, olive-drab footlocker, the kind he had seen in old war movies. He assumed it was just an empty piece of junk that the previous homeowner had buried to get rid of. There was something inside. The box was secured with two heavy rusted latches. The lid opened with a long, rusty squeal. He peered inside, and the moment he saw the contents, his face drained of all color. This was not a box of old tools or forgotten keepsakes. He saw the distinct, menacing shapes of old ammunition rounds, rifle cartridges, and the unmistakable, pineapple-like, serrated form of several World War II-era hand grenades. Harold stumbled backward, his mind reeling. The quiet, decade-long mystery of the growing lump in his backyard had just become a life-or-death situation. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed 911. Harold's 911 call was met with a moment of stunned silence, followed by a series of urgent, rapid-fire questions from the dispatcher. The response was immediate and serious. Within minutes, his quiet suburban street was filled with the flashing lights of police cars. The officers established a perimeter, evacuating Harold and his wife from their home and securing the area. They were not equipped to handle a threat like this. A call was made to a nearby military base, and soon a specialized explosive ordnance disposal, or EOD, team was on its way. What had started as a simple gardening project had now turned into a full-blown bomb squad operation. Carefully examined the contents of the rusted metal box, the story shifts from a personal discovery to a historical one. To understand why a man would bury live grenades in his own backyard, we must travel back to the end of the Second World War in 1945. Millions of young American soldiers, known as GIs, were returning home after years of brutal conflict in Europe and the Pacific. They were greeted with parades and celebrations, hailed as the heroes of the greatest generation. But beneath the surface of this joyous homecoming, many of these young men were carrying deep, invisible wounds. They had witnessed the unimaginable horrors of industrial warfare, and they were returning to a quiet, civilian world that could not possibly comprehend their experiences. In that era, the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder was not understood. These men were expected to simply put the war behind them, to get a job, start a family, and seamlessly reintegrate into society. Many did, but they often did so by building a wall of silence around their wartime experiences. One of the common and often dangerous ways that soldiers held onto a piece of their past was by bringing home souvenirs. They brought back enemy flags, helmets, and bayonets, but they also brought back weapons. It was a widespread practice for GIS to smuggle home pistols, rifles, and even deactivated grenades as mementos of their service, a tangible link to the most intense and life-altering period of their lives. Back in the present, the bomb squad had safely removed the dangerously deteriorated explosives from Harold's backyard. The police investigation now focused on a single question: who had buried them? They began to research the history of the house. They discovered that the first owner, the man who had built the house in the late 1940s, was a decorated veteran of the Second World War. He had served in the Pacific Theater and had returned home in 1945 to start a new life. He had passed away peacefully in the 1980s, and his family had sold the house years later. The police managed to track down the veteran's now elderly children and interviewed them. They told the investigators that their father was a kind and loving man, but he was also intensely private. He had a box of medals in his desk and a single, framed photograph of his unit, but he never, ever spoke about what he had seen or done in the war. It was a closed and locked door in his life. They had no idea that he had brought back, let alone buried, any weapons in the backyard. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The investigators concluded that the veteran, upon returning from the horrors of war and starting a new, peaceful life with a wife and children, had made a profound and secret decision. He needed to bury his past, literally. The weapons were not just souvenirs, they were dangerous, physical reminders of the violence and trauma he wanted to leave behind. He likely buried the box in the backyard to protect his new family from the items, and to symbolically separate the soldier he had been from the husband and father he now wanted to be. He had buried his ghosts. Harold Wilson stood in his quiet backyard, watching as the last of the police vehicles drove away. The hole in his lawn was the only visible reminder of the day's incredible events. The strange lump that had puzzled him for a decade was not a geological quirk or a buried tree stump. It was a hidden legacy of the Second World War, a quiet soldier's buried trauma which the slow, patient, and relentless power of the earth itself had pushed back to the surface. It is a profound story that reminds us that the echoes of our greatest conflicts are never truly gone. They lie dormant and hidden, just beneath the surface of our peaceful, everyday lives, waiting for a curious gardener with a shovel to unearth their silent, explosive secrets.